Our topic for this part of the neuro lecture is to take a look at age-related considerations in the neurologic system. So we'll take a look at some of the specific childhood neuropathologies. We'll take a very quick look at febrile seizure, spina bifida, and also cerebral palsy, and then end with reviewing the significant changes that occur with aging. I've added this slide because I realized we hadn't talked about brain development yet, and this will be in your materials. So when we think about brain development, I think it's important that as we use that background, we remember that intrauterine brain development continues throughout the pregnancy, and actually growth in the third trimester of the pregnancy is exponential. The brain increases by about fourfold. There was a recent study that was done at Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C., and they compared preterm with term infants. Average age of the preterm infants was 27 weeks, and in the term infants was 39 weeks. But what they found in their work is that infants that were born prior to 32 weeks gestation demonstrated lower brain volumes in the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the intracranial cavity, even though there were no significant structural injury or structural integrity issues noted. So I think this is important for us to remember because it goes to the importance of that brain development in the third trimester. Remember, in the cerebrum, we're thinking about issues like speech, thought, emotion, learning. In the cerebellum, we continue to consider learning, social behavior functions, balance, and complex motor functions. So that last trimester of pregnancy becomes very important in increasing the maturity of some of those areas of the brain that are so very important. Also, the brain continues to develop and change through adolescence. The brain isn't really done developing until we're about 20 years old. This has clear implications for the ability to heal after injury. You could actually say it makes it better for us to heal, and we'll heal a little bit faster. But it's very interesting in how this affects substance abuse. What we've identified is that when teens abuse substances, they are much more likely to become addicted because the brain development has changed to incorporate the substance that they're abusing. So their brain actually is different as a result of their substance abuse when they were teenagers because of that unfinished brain development that has to occur during adolescence. In addition to, with that sort of as a background, in addition to the things we just talked about, we have to think about when the CNS actually does develop. Well, it develops very, very early in gestation and begins that development with the neural plate, the neural groove, and the neural tube. So this is happening during that first trimester. We know that the neural tube itself is very, very sensitive to maternal folate. That's why if you look at the average prenatal vitamin, not only do they have iron in them, they have a fair amount of folate. That's also one of the reasons why we have a lot of folic acid added to many of our foods. When we look at that neural tube and what happens early in gestation, one of the disorders that we need to be very alert for and that manifests with this neural area is spina bifida. Spina bifida occurs when the vertebra, that column, fails to close, and it's due to incomplete development. So what happens is sometimes you'll just have spina bifida, but generally the spina bifida is associated with a meningocele or a myelomeningocele. Myelomeningocele is more common than meningocele. But you start off with the spina bifida, which is the failure of the vertebra to close. The meningocele then is the meninges protruding through that unclosed vertebral arch. So that's just the meninges protruding. More commonly, you will also have the meninges. They become dilated, and part of the spinal cord also protrudes through this vertebral defect. Now, clearly, this means that there are more likely to be more significant motor and sensory alterations, but also it's important that with a myelomeningocele, this is more likely to be associated with hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus is the accumulation of fluid within the ventricles of the brain. Because of this accumulation of fluid within the ventricles of the brain, the ventricles actually become wider, and that puts then pressure on the parenchyma, the tissue of the brain itself. The way this manifests is through a rapid increase in the head circumference, and the baby may also manifest with seizures. Now you can imagine with all this fluid within the ventricles of the brain, this is going to cause an increase in the intracranial pressure because all of that fluid is causing the brain tissue to press out against the cranium. Because of the increased intracranial pressure, there's going to be a decrease in cerebral perfusion pressure as well as cerebral blood flow. So this is something that has to be monitored very carefully, and if necessary, that fluid can actually be diverted from the ventricles into the peritoneal cavity so that you don't have these negative effects on intracranial pressure. With a spina bifida, and with a myelomeningocele and a meningocele, the motor and sensory alteration will depend on both the location of where the defect is as well as the severity of the defect. And a myelomeningocele, many of these occur in the lumbar area. A febrile seizure may be either a simple or a complex seizure, but frequently will manifest as a tonic-clonic seizure in a child. It's important to remember, though, with a febrile seizure, this seizure is occurring in the absence of central nervous system infection. So it's usually an upper respiratory, an ear infection, something that has caused usually an infant or a young child's temperature to climb rapidly. For every degree centigrade temperature increase, there is a corresponding 10% increase in the metabolic demand by those brain cells. So we know that this is something that is scary for parents, for the child, and we want to bring that temperature down and take that metabolic demand off the brain. One of the important pediatric considerations to be aware of is cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is not a single thing. It's actually a group or a spectrum of palsies, and cerebral palsy occurs before the age of 3 years. 70% of cerebral palsy occurs prior to birth. So what this is then is either damage to the developing brain through a malformation, or the damage to the developing brain may be due to maternal rubella, CMV, some sort of maternal disorder. Now, we also know that cerebral palsy can actually occur due to a birth injury, or it can occur after birth itself. But cerebral palsy, whether it occurs prior to birth, as a result of a birth injury, which is not the most common, or following birth, like an illness following birth, that these occur before the age of 3 years. What's been identified is we want to watch mother very carefully for some risk factors that could tell us that the baby may be in trouble. They may have a child that's developing a cerebral palsy. And so we watch mom for protein in the urine. We watch mom for bleeding late in the pregnancy. And we also monitor mom for hyper as well as hypothyroidism. All three well, actually four of these risk factors, proteinuria, bleeding late in the pregnancy, and hyper as well as hypothyroidism has been associated with cerebral palsy in the infant. So we know that there is either injury or abnormal development of the brain, and there are lots and lots of prenatal, perinatal, and postnatal etiologies. But what happens in a cerebral palsy is that this abnormal development or injury to the brain results in disorders of movement, muscular coordination and tone, and or posture. As a result, then, the child develops ataxia, spasticity, a characteristic scissor gait, and may have some toe walking. Now, cognitive disability and seizure may or may not occur, and I think that's one of the things that the general public doesn't have a good understanding of. They make a presumption that all children with cerebral palsy have cognitive disabilities, and that is not true, although anywhere from 30 to 50% of the kids do have some sort of cognitive or sensory disability. The most common cognitive disabilities include mental retardation and learning disabilities. Sensory disabilities may affect speech, hearing, and vision deficits. And then again, seizures may or may not occur, so the child may or may not have a seizure disorder. What's important to remember, though, is that these effects of the cerebral palsies, this group or spectrum, the effects of cerebral palsy are permanent, but they are not progressive. As we look at the other end of the age range, we think about the effects of aging. And so there are numerous effects of aging on the neurologic system. One thing that happens as we get older is our brain decreases in weight as well as size. So basically our brain, as we get older and older, begins to atrophy. So as that brain atrophies, that then starts to put stress on the bridging vessels between the epidural area and the skull itself, because there are bridging vessels between the lining and the skull. Because that puts stress on those bridging vessels, as we get older and older, we have a higher risk of an epidural bleed or epidural hematoma. We know that as we get older, there's an increase in atherosclerosis. That then leads to a higher rate of stroke, as well as that vascular dementia that we talked about. Our blood-brain barrier becomes more permeable. So does that then make us more likely to develop an encephalitis? We have a decrease in our myelin production, the dendritic processes, and the health as well as the maintenance in our synaptic connections. What that then leads to are some changes in coordination as well as muscular function. And all at the same time, we're starting to have a decrease in the amount as well as the distribution of some of our neurotransmitters. So for example, we know that there is a degeneration and fewer transporters in the serotonin system. So with either degeneration of serotonin or fewer serotonin transporters, what this results in is mild cognitive impairment before you'll see memory decline that is the same as dementia. Remember, we talked about cognitive decline. We know that as we get older, we see some decreases in our sensory function. Our vision, our hearing, and our taste begins to decline. And then last but not least, because of the speed of transmission along our neurons, we have a decrease in our tendon reflexes as well as the decrease in the sensation of vibration in the periphery. So if we take everything together that we've talked about, we know that the neurologic system is an incredibly complex system, and it's one of the most complex in the body. And that takes a lot for me to say because you know I like kidneys. But if we have an understanding of how the brain works and how the spinal cord and the peripheral nerves work together, and then get a sense of those neurotransmitters, that helps us understand pathology, how it presents, and how it manifests. And like many areas of the body, we're still learning. But I think we've got even farther to go in the brain and really understanding our brain than in any other part. Thank you so much once again for your attention. I know that you have been cognitively aware and working very hard cognitively. Let me know if you have any questions.